All right, welcome back. Thanks for rejoining us. This panel has probably got some of the best minds and forward thinkers in the business on the subject of terrorism, intelligence, and policing. I'm John Miller, Assistant Director of the FBI for Public Affairs. Prior to that, I was Deputy Chief of the LAPD for Counterterrorism and Intelligence, so I've looked at this issue from both sides. So since I can be biased either way, they let me be the moderator. Chief Bill Bratton, former New York City Police Commissioner, now Chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, and my former boss, comes from a city, thank you, comes from a city that is probably, between New York, Washington, and LA, one of the top terrorist targets in the nation, and a city that probably, of all the post-9/11 plots, had the plot that came closest to actually happening before it was interdicted by local police working very closely with their federal partners. And I think we'll probably touch on that story today. Mark Delaney, Superintendent of the Massachusetts State Police. There is no place in the country that you can really touch on that hasn't been affected by this subject in one way or another. And though many people don't think of it, first off, Massachusetts may be more than you know. It's where Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, ended up diverted to Logan Airport, where that device was handled by his bomb squad. It's where the 9/11 hijackers boarded the planes, going through security at that airport to launch their attacks, and where they stayed in the immediate minutes before that. And it's a place where they had a political convention over a summer during a very high threat period, where they had to deal with mixing intelligence, counterterrorism, policing, while running a massive civic government event in the heart of their biggest city. Dean Esserman from Providence. He's another New York transplant who's worked with Commissioner Bratton, worked in the transit police here in New York, and has been a chief of police in cities in Connecticut and now Rhode Island. He is a police chief who walks that line every day, straddling the very difficult balance between Homeland security. There are enough targets in Providence, and I'm aware of the FBI cases in his city enough to know that there's a level of investigative activity there at any one time involving counterterrorism. To walk that line that they all walk between Homeland security and hometown security. He's got to deal with a crime problem and the potential for terrorism, but with the limited resources of a city like Providence and his police department. Rick Fuentes, Superintendent of the New Jersey State Police. Here is a police executive who, in a state where the bomb that blew up the World Trade Center in 1993 was actually built in a garage in New Jersey and stored at a storage place, where the blind sheikh who preached destruction and jihad from a mosque in Jersey City was an inspirational leader to some of the attacks that were followed and some that were prevented against the George Washington Bridge, the Holland and Lincoln Tunnel, federal buildings in the United Nations. But it is also a place where, if you go back to 2004, some of the most detailed plans for pre-incident indicators for an attack that were recovered in a laptop computer overseas targeted the national headquarters of the Prudential Insurance Company in Newark. What Rick Fuentes has done, and he'll talk about this today, is to take the New Jersey State Police from a conventional state police model and literally turn it into a state homeland security, policing, intelligence, and counterterrorism agency, which is a very interesting model. Sandra Hutchins, a colleague of mine from Los Angeles. She is the head of counterterrorism for the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office. It is hard to conceive for people in New York the actual size and spread of Los Angeles. What's the miles there?
It's a lot, 10 million people. I don't know the mileage.
10 million people, and in the world economy, it would be the third largest economy. It's actually an American anomaly. But it is also a place, as Chief Bratton will tell you, that has been the subject of post-9/11 plots. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's debriefings about the plot to fly planes into the Library Tower, the tallest building on the West Coast or west of the Mississippi, is something that the president referenced yesterday and has referenced before. So it is a city with challenges, targets, and it is, from the county perspective, 88 towns and cities, 44 of which, literally half of which, the sheriff has to police and protect. And John Timoney, another former New Yorker, police commissioner of Miami, before that Philadelphia, before that first deputy commissioner of the NYPD. So we know we have an incredible level of talent there, and a guy who can't hold a job. But, I'm sorry, that slipped. And a guy who's very much in demand. But an individual who had to keep Philadelphia together in its downtown area with its tall glass high-rises as people self-evacuated to flee the city on September 11, 2001 in Philadelphia, but who just a few months ago in Miami, working in tandem with the FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Force, helped interdict yet another one of 5 active terrorist plots that have unfolded targeting targets on U.S. soil, 4 of which involving operators on U.S. soil in just the past 12 months. I say that to set the table because in the overview, and anybody in this room, from Gary McCarthy to Jeff Miller to all the other police executives, can tell you nothing has been the same for them since September 11th. It has become a new function, the counterterrorism role, that local police used to leave largely to the FBI and the national security apparatus, now which they're full partners in. And part of what we'll talk about today is how their partnership is becoming more important exponentially as we deal with issues like homegrown terrorism. Because as Phil Mudd said to start off the day, it is not so much exclusively the threat from a foreign headquarters or hub or a base in Afghanistan as it was before 9/11. It is the threat of Madrid, where the operators are in your cities, committing small-time crimes to raise money, or robbing gas stations to buy weapons, or involved in other crimes, that local police may be more likely and better positioned than the FBI to actually run into in the course of their normal duties, as well as their intelligence. That is how I'd like to frame the larger picture. But I'd like to just start off with Chief Bratton. How much time did you spend as police commissioner of the NYPD on counterterrorism in 1994 and 95 versus what you spend now in Los Angeles?
New York, and this was within a year or two after the first World Trade Center bombing. As police commissioner in that city, I probably did not spend anywhere from 2 to 5% of my time. 5% would be a real stretch. In Los Angeles, easily 40% of my time is now focused on this issue. Conferences like this, meetings. That's how the world has changed from 1994 to now 2006.
Now, some would argue that Los Angeles, it's not New York, it's not Washington, it's a West Coast place. But you feel that you're a target in a big way.
I'll give you 2 thoughts on that, John. We have clearly been targeted. The Torrance case that John and I worked on when he was head of counterintelligence for me, a threat that emanated in the jails and moved very quickly into common-type robbery to fund the idea of raising funds to get weaponry to attack recruiting centers and Jewish houses of worship. The reality of terrorism, it's there. And it's not coming, it's there. So we need to focus energy on it. But going to the larger theme, and this is the issue of, if you will, first preventers, the role of law enforcement. Our role is actually to take the leadership here because the federal government has not done it. Much the same as in the 90s in terms of dealing with traditional crime, and particularly in this city. It was local policing that came up with the ideas and in partnership with the federal government that provided the 100,000 extra cops, provided the money, provided the additional jails, provided the research, which was so important, and the technology We got it done. Overall violent crime down 40% in the country, 30% reduction overall. We're now starting to see that creep up. The crime conference that many of us attended last week indicating that crime is coming back because the federal government, once again, stepped away from the partnership in their role of supporting local police. In dealing with terrorism in this country, the increasing concern about the homegrown threat is going to be local police who are going to basically put it together. And the role of the federal government, no disrespect to you now in your new capacity, will be to support. And up until this point, the support has not been all that has been needed. It has been buying a lot of things for us, but it is not paying for a lot of what we need, which are intelligence analysts, additional personnel. So we got it right in the 90s. In the 21st century, the feds have been stepping away from the partnership. We know how to deal with this terrorism issue. It's very much the same way we dealt with traditional crime. But once again, we're finding that we cannot get the feds fully engaged in this portion of the partnership, and they have almost gotten totally disengaged on the other partnership, which is dealing with traditional crime. In local law enforcement, we're lifting a barbell, and we've got to keep that barbell balanced. We're still trying to get the federal government engaged in understanding you don't lift just one side of it, you got to lift both sides.
Mark Delaney, from the Massachusetts State Police standpoint, with responsibilities for Logan Airport, which we already talked about today, intelligence in the state police game used to boil down to motorcycle gangs, narcotics, organized crime. How has the world changed for you?
It's changed dramatically with the advent of the Commonwealth Fusion Center, which is under the custody of the Massachusetts State Police. It belongs to the entire Commonwealth and serves the entire Commonwealth, but because of the size and dimension of our department, we are the ones who are the custodian of that facility. I agree with Bill completely on the fact that it's the local police officers. There's one thing I've always heard, and it's been said before, there is no federal neighborhoods, there are only local neighborhoods. And the terrorists live there, and that's where they're going to live there, and that's where they're going to be first observed. And it's going to be a local police officer who's doing his job, being nosy, knowing his community, speaking to his community, who's going to find out that information and see some strangers in town and see some strange gatherings, collect that information, and what we're trying to do is get them to feed the Fusion Center, get this data, we're trying to make it easy for them to do, and get it to the Fusion Center where the analysts can then figure out what it all means and maybe get some leads, and then working with the local police department. Maybe it has to be bumped up to the federal agencies or the state police with our anti-terrorism units or the members we have assigned to the JTTF. Maybe we can pursue this and try to make something of it and try to decipher it. But it's going to start, I believe, from a local police officer doing his job in the street, paying attention.
Dean Esserman, Providence has not had a terrorist attack. We haven't uncovered a plan in Providence that was imminent, although we have terrorism cases in Providence, and you know that from your people who are on the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Is that something that gives you a license to write that off because you have a crime problem to deal with that you're succeeding with? And how do you strike that balance of dealing with one and not forgetting the other? Homeland security versus hometown security.
Thank you. I too want to thank the Manhattan Institute for bringing me back to my hometown where I was born and raised. I want to recognize two people who have a lot of influence on all of us up here, Professor George Cowling and Chief Michael O'Connor, who had a great deal of influence on me and all of us. The way I look at it is that I'm a patriot. I love my country. I love it desperately. I'm a father. I love my children. And this country of ours seems to be a giant that when it focuses on a problem, it can deal with it. But it seems this giant is a cyclops with but one eye. And when it pivots to look at another problem, it forgets what it had looked at. And I echo my mentor's comments, Bill Bratton, that this really needs to be a two-front war. We buried 16,000 Americans last year. Americans on our own soil from murder. We buried 16,000 the year before. I'll bury children in my city over the weeks ahead. We have a crime problem in our country. It isn't going away. We seem to have put so much focus on it, but when the giant pivoted, it forgot what it was looking at. And though Providence is one of a handful of cities where crime is going down, for the last 18 months in a row, crime is going up in almost every city in America, in particular violent crime. We're burying more children, we're losing more people, and it seems that we don't know how to look at two things at the same time. And I need to, because I'm losing my children in my city to crime. And at the same time, I've been given a responsibility now to worry as an American, to worry as the responsible person for public safety in my city, to worry about my children's future, that there could be an attack from Homeland, on our homeland from those overseas or those in our midst. And my greatest concern for our country is that we don't seem to know how to do both. We seem to, in the past few years, rapidly abandon our commitment to the public safety and domestic tranquility. The federal government had done some remarkable work, and the federal government's response to crime in our country was not to hire more FBI agents or to hire more federal prosecutors, but to give money to hire more police officers. There are now less police officers on duty in America than there were on September 11th. Thousands less in New York City, thousands less in many cities across the country, but less officers on duty in every city in the nation than there were on September 11th, because this great giant of our country pivoted and forgot what it was looking at and decided to take all the money it had and move it somewhere else. Yet my children in my city are going to die of crime, or they could die from a terrible attack. And the question is, why can't we look at both? And that is a terrible frustration for an American police chief, because we have twin responsibilities now, but we don't seem to have assistance to work on both.
That is a very interesting conversation, and one that drove a recent conference between chiefs on crime. And it's interesting as you go from the terrorism conferences to the crime conferences, how these messages fuse. Rick Fuentes, you took the New Jersey State Police, which was an agency that was in most ways a conventional state police agency, and transformed it into a very different place. What were you thinking and why? What is it about New Jersey and its geography that made you decide that the state police had to take the leadership in this role?
Well, John, I was looking over your arm trying to see my question, and
Intelligence.
it's intelligence-led policing.
I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable, but actually 20 years as a reporter, I actually always have them upside down because that's the way I'm used to reading notes.
Well, unfortunately, I read Dean's question, but I'm going to try and answer that.
It's all right. I know the answer to your question. You want me to take a run at it?
I think you said it before. Actually, and you mentioned Prudential. It was actually more than a year before Prudential that I think we as an organization kind of got the message, and it was very much rooted in economics. When I first came into this job, it was right around the time that DHS had started, and they were bringing us along this paint chart that was driving us all collectively nuts and costing us about $250,000 a day in overtime. So clearly we realized, really every police leader realized, that under this type of a system we could only provide vigilance insofar as we had the budget to pay for it. For us it was about $250,000 a day, with great interruption and disruption to our organization. So back in 2004, coincidentally right before the Madrid bombings in the spring, we formed the Homeland Security Branch. It was kind of motivated by two things. When we had a response or respond to these alerts, we had a lot of horsepower in the organization, a lot of units that we could deploy, but it was like a race car that was shaped like a bread box. So we were able to go strong, but it took a little while to get there. And the decision-making protocols within the organization that were required, aviation was here, K-9 was here, our truck inspectors, which always seem to be, trucks are involved in almost every alert, were at another point far-flung in the organization, so our decision tree looked like a bush There were just so many people that were involved in a decision-making process. So we formed the Homeland Security Branch. We started at the organization chart on the left. We moved across to the right with all of our commanders, very much in consensus. And we put all of those first preventers into very much into an investigations, intelligence type mode, and our first responders into the Homeland Security Branch. And that really allowed us to deploy with a lot of speed that, believe it or not, did not involve me as a decision maker. The one thing that we wanted was to bring all of those units and sections and bureaus together, deploy them based upon the alert very quickly without having to go through the chain of command, but to make one phone call to the commander of the Homeland Security Branch. For us, it was the largest reorganization in state police history. We moved 1,100 people in our organization around, but most importantly, and I think this is something every police executive has to realize, is that we can't rely just on specialized units to solve the issue of vigilance and counterterrorism. We have to weave counterterrorism into the daily routines so that training flights on helicopters are done over infrastructures. Truck inspectors, and we have 160 of them, just don't do it off turnpike exits, but they do it near nuclear plants where attacks using trucks might be perhaps the most vulnerable. So that was largely the Homeland Security Branch, and the establishment of it caused a sea change in the organization, kept us doing Homeland Security all the time, every day, every week.
Now, that is a dynamic story of rapid change in an organization driven in the post 9/11 world. Very similar, actually, to the construct of the Homeland Security Bureau at the Sheriff's Department. But if you look at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, a place challenged by limited resources, serious crime problems, gang problems, the draining prospect of running one of the, if not the largest jail systems in the country, you did a lot of the same things, but you did them in 1998 by forming the Terrorism Early Warning Group. There was no September 11th. There hadn't been a Millennium Plot or a Cole bombing. What brought the LA County Sheriff's Department to the cutting edge first?
Well, in 1996, we had two deputies. Sometimes this is where the best ideas come from in our organizations at the line level, who had a focus on terrorism before 9/11. And I have to admit, the rest of us were focused on traditional crime and basically told these two, well, you can spend your own time working on this, but we've got real issues out there. They were focused way ahead of the curve for us, and fortunately for us, they continued to do what they felt was important to do. And they formed the Terrorism Early Working Group, which started with 2 people and expanded out. It got a little bigger than that before 9/11. And one of the architects of that program was John Sullivan, who some of you may remember was on CNN the day of 9/11 because he was the one in Los Angeles who understood terrorism for us. We have expanded it greatly since that time. My boss, Sheriff Lee Baca, recognized that we local law enforcement have a big role in this and in this new counterterrorism intelligence world, and formed the Office of Homeland Security. I am the 2nd division chief to be in charge of that division. I've been there for 3.5 years. And what John Miller alluded to, we have been under tight budget constraints. As mentioned before, we do contract policing for 40-some cities, and we have to fill those cars. We don't have the luxury of moving bodies at will if we have an issue. And so we have fought hard to get funding for our counterterrorism and intelligence efforts. But as I said, the sheriff feels very strongly about this. We understand the community. I think that's local law enforcement's strength. We know our communities, and we've just begun an effort probably about 1.5 years ago to form the Muslim American Homeland Security Congress, which is a group of Muslims who represent all of the Muslim organizations, CARE, MPAC, COPA, the Pakistani organization, who came to us and said, we're tired of being reactionary. We want to be proactive in this. We want to work with you. And I got to tell you, it's been a tremendous benefit for us. I've learned more about the Muslim community than I ever knew before. And the question was posed earlier about the synagogue, or the mosque. How is local law enforcement going into the mosque and working the mosque? Let me tell you something. A lot of this stuff is being done under the radar in terms of the radicalization. It is not being done openly in most of the mosques. And so it's very important for us to have that relationship. And I had one Muslim gentleman say to me, how do I know if my son is being radicalized if he begins to pray more times a day? Is he more religious? Is he more fervent in his religion? Or is he being radicalized? And so I don't think it's as easy as we might like to think for the Muslim community to recognize what is happening in their mosque and in their world. So that's it.
And we're going to, as time allows, get back to that as well as the theme that Dean raised. John Timity, Miami is a tourist attraction. It is a vibrant city in its own right, aside from the visitors who come there. It is also a place where we've seen a recent case unfold. How has the specter of terrorism and policing changed the way you do business from the time you came into this business?
Oh, I think it's completely changed. And it was interesting. When I went to Miami, I experienced the same. I had the same experience. I had in other cities that were away from New York that really didn't have their guard up. Most people figured, well, it happened in New York twice, and it's confined to New York. And so Miami really didn't have a significant anti-terrorism / security plan. And that became evident my first week or two there. Borrowing a helicopter and touring the city, you realize the vulnerabilities in Miami. It really is by the sea. There's just so many inlets and waterways. And then, of course, the Miami River, which literally goes up through the city, dividing the city, is a huge vulnerability. And so we put together quickly a security plan for the entire city, but also focused on the river and the port. And additionally, went out. It's interesting, they had done away with their aviation unit. And I don't think any major city can do without an aviation unit, because there are things you see from the air that you cannot pick up just driving around a patrol car. I think the interesting part on the speakers this morning, the one thing I took out from all of them, that this job is, one, a lot more difficult than it was September 11th, when there was a centralized Al-Qaeda. Now, when you look at what we're focused on, the homegrown terrorists, they don't fit any stereotype, if there's such a thing. I think in the public domain, particularly with the press, there's a perception out there that a terrorist has to look like Muhammad Ali going through an airport. But if you look, whether it's Madrid, just common drug dealers. The London bombers look like normal middle-class kids, some disaffected. You look at Miami and L.A., I mean, they do not fit any stereotype. I thought Phil's opening remarks that it doesn't have to be somebody that buys into an ideology. It could be somebody who's just doing a whack job or a Columbine type situation. And so it's really, I think, more important. In some respects, it's more important now for the local police, because it can literally come at you from any quarters. And so maybe the tip comes from a confidential informant that your narcotics bureau is working with, or a B cop happens to pick up some information from somebody in the neighborhood. What I can tell you, in the most recent case in Miami, and this is why it's so difficult, folks in that neighborhood, it's a model city area, it's a poor African American area, but they saw those guys drilling and training. They just figured, they're just whack jobs, drilling and training, Well, the problem, and when we first got the case, there was some skepticism on the part of us and the FBI. But you get the information, you can't disregard it. You have the information, you own it, and you need to follow it to its natural conclusion. And while when we did the press conference, I know that the eyes of the press were rolling. These people, at least some of them, were very serious. They intended on doing damage. They had the the attitude, they had everything going. What they didn't have was the means, and they were in the process of getting the means when the case was shut down. Again, and I think Phil brought up a good point this morning, that I think we're better off. We may be criticized for shutting down these cases or lower charges, but I think that's the way to do it, that you need to disrupt these things no matter how they come at you. And the final interesting point, he's talking about the scorecard, and there's an article, I think it's in this week's either Time or U.S. News and World Report, where federal authorities are now being criticized for, you've arrested 500 and now you've only prosecuted successfully 250. It kind of misses the whole point.
Well, thank you for that. Now, we've gone across the panel in the traditional panel model. Let's go from being a panel to being a conversation. I think John has set the table in a very interesting way, because he's taken us from the 5 years after 9/11 into the changing shape of things that Phil alluded to this morning, the homegrown threat. I think going to Los Angeles, the LA case is a very interesting example. What does what we call the Torrance case say about terrorism, policing, and our communities? And if you want to run through a synopsis of the case and for those who aren't familiar with it.
Just briefly, the Torrance case, it has several names, was begun when two detectives working a series of robberies, gas stations, convenience stores, staked out based on their pattern analysis, their intelligence gathering, analysis of it, and rapid response to it, staked it out, and sure enough, the two characters show up and rob a gas station. They're arrested. And instead of just ending with the arrest, which oftentimes is the way the cops do it, you get the clearance, you move on to the next case, they did a rollback warrant, went to the houses of these characters, and while going through, fortunately these detectives had some training on terrorism issues and noticed materials that appeared to be terrorist related, and immediately began moving it up the chain of command, Joint Terrorism Task Force, to the extent that within a very short period of time, John was in charge of our counterterrorism group at the time, that I think we had about 80 to 100 of our personnel working with over about 150 federal agents who had been brought in from all over the country. This was the real thing. These were a couple of characters who had been motivated by an individual whom one of them had met in a state prison, who was a self-proclaimed Muslim leader, cleric, and he was now actively running people out of prison to basically commit robberies, to gather funds, to buy firearms, and the plot that was deterred was to, on Jewish holidays, to effectively machine gun people going to synagogue and to attack military recruiting stations. It was thwarted, took a lot of effort, but it moved like that, based on a simple gas station robbery, but the ability to basically put it all together. And that's where we're at. That's where the linkage is between traditional crime and now the new type of crime, the new form of crime. The good news is that, again, repeating my earlier remarks, in the 90s we got it right. We understood to deal with traditional crime you need intelligence. You need to gather it all the time. You need to analyze. You need to share it. The fusion centers. Fusion centers are certainly the way to go. In Los Angeles, we're going to take $10 million of our Homeland Security funds and create effectively an intelligence computer system that will gather information from all the various agencies, and there are 45 different police agencies just in the county of Los Angeles alone. We're all going to dump all of our criminal intelligence into this center. Everybody has the ability to analyze it, and we're going to share it. $10 million project is going to combine CopLink, it's going to combine the Links program. We're evolving. We're not evolving as fast as we'd like, but it really reinforces the idea of getting the bastards before they get us, that whether you interrupt them when they're marching around in the field with no real skills or equipment yet, or getting them when they're moving into a tactical operation, which they were very close to doing in Torrance.
How many people here are engaged in some kind of fusion center, either running one or building one? So it really is the wave of the future, which is, I think people have all been collecting dots and connecting dots, but the idea of pouring everybody's dots into one bucket and looking at them together. I know you looked at, Chief Timney, the Terrorism Early Warning Group model, the New York model, and everything that was out there to look at, in a place like Miami, which is not dissimilar to Los Angeles in terms of the county, the towns and cities, lacking a terrorist attack, something you can look back on and say, you know, we had this happen. Do you have trouble driving that, given other responsibilities?
The trouble, and it's a constant, is that at the end of the day, this terrorism stuff, working on it, it's actually pretty boring. And so my contention is that to keep the cops interested, because the biggest enemy is complacency, to keep the cops interested is that when you get through these intel centers, you deal with not just terrorism, but with regular crime, with the fusion centers, and that keeps the juices flowing. Because the information, the terrorism information, doesn't come in a steady flow, and sometimes there are huge gaps, and so you need to be able to fill that time dealing with ordinary crime. And so the fusion centers dealing not just with terrorism helps drive it forward, helps keep the, if you will, the interest.
In our city, a mid-sized city, the biggest city between New York and Boston, I dare say if you ask any of our officers in the department, what are your marching orders? Because I've told them, just as I would be able to wake up out of a nightmare in the middle of the night and see Bill Bratton's face when we all worked for him.
How many of your night dreams is a nightmare?
And our marching orders in New York, everybody knew there were three things: crime, fear, public disorder. We added Homeland Defense. Those are the four marching orders for every officer in the department. We created a Homeland Defense division, but we also put every officer in the entire department through Homeland Defense training. Every officer in the department has turnout gear with them. And then we took all, and this was mentioned earlier, I tell my commanders, I don't care how hard they work, it means nothing to me. I just care about results. And that their job is to be responsible for the result, and therefore they need to leverage whatever resources they can. Well, like most cities, we have more private security than we do public police. 4 times as many, of about a little over 2,000 private security officers in our city between the universities and the hospitals and the corporations. We put all of them through a training program, and we put them all through the training program in the same classroom with our officers. So they were in class side by side, which is unusual. Private security is the other side of the Gaza Strip, and not until someone's looking for a retirement job do they usually pay attention to private security. But for us, we trained every private security officer in the same classroom with every officer on initial recognition factors and on initial response factors. And then on a very regular basis, we have a meeting between our police commanders and our private security directors where we talk about just what John Timoney said. We talk about crime issues, and we also interlace it with terrorism issues, alerts. In fact, our fusion center, which we are now standing up in Rhode Island over the next few months, Providence insisted that private security be brought to the table and that private security be part of the fusion center. And they're going to be, and they're going to fund part of it and put people in there. So I think that our job is to leverage our resources. And what I heard that was most interesting by our first speaker from the FBI is that the resource we leveraged so successfully in our community policing efforts, which was the community, need to be leveraged here. That it really is a triumvirate between public security, the police, and the federal government agencies, private security, which vastly outnumber us and always will, and the community. And that those will probably be the 3 legs of the stool that will work together to mine the intelligence, mine the information, and share it in communities across the country. It is the direction we're going in our city of Providence.
Chief, did you want to?
Two quick comments following up on Dean's issue about the education, about getting everybody into the game. The dirty little secret in policing, law enforcement, in traditional crime is how badly we play the game. That if you think of it, there is no place in America where we teach crime reduction. How do you do it? It's all self-taught in some respects, coming up through the ranks. We go to a school here and there. But there is really no place that teaches what we have now learned how to do. You would not want to be operated on by a doctor who basically had just come up through the ranks and had not gone to all the appropriate schools. We don't do that with traditional crime. And now with the new emerging crime, terrorism, we're in danger of making the same mistake about not putting together a comprehensive educational program, because we're going to be into this for the rest of our lives. I think we all understand that, in our children's lives. So in terms of following up on Dean's issue about getting everybody into the game, that's one thing. But we need to do it more than with sound bites, like conferences like this. It needs to be in a much more comprehensive fashion. And once again, that's where getting the federal entity into this in a more comprehensive way, traditional crime and terrorism, that we really need to be developing models of training. That's one of the things the Manhattan Institute, and applause to them, is as a think tank, really working very hard with New York, now with LA, to develop models that we can then very quickly move out from, in our case, LA, to the other UASC fusion centers. What works? What's the best practice? Giving us access to all these experts around the world. And it continues to be a major omission in fighting traditional crime, and my concern would be that we repeat that omission and that mistake as we move into this new arena.
A lot of people would accept the premise that there are communities that have a lack of trust in the FBI and a great suspicion, the Arab American community, Muslim community among them. Do you all, as you sit here, think that there's a higher level of trust because of the very different relationship? Because I know the effort that we're putting into building bridges now as the FBI to try and retake some of that lost ground and make up some of that time. But the difference between the FBI and local police is when your baby's sick, nobody calls the FBI. When your mother falls down the stairs, they don't call the FBI. Your ability to forge relationships with the community based on coming to deal with people in their worst moments actually creates a bridge. Sandra in Los Angeles really talked a good deal about the very forward-leaning efforts of the Sheriff's Department. But in your cities and towns, based on more discussion of the homegrown threat, which shouldn't be the reason to have good community relations, but might be a driver in placing some urgency on it. Are you going into the mosques and meeting halls? Are you extending the hand of friendship into places where they're nervous about the police?
In Los Angeles, Sheriff Barker has, more so than just about any American law enforcement official I'm familiar with, has really been focused on this, has been to Pakistan, talks about it all the time, has set up any number of opportunities for that exchange, and as recently as this coming Monday, that there's going to be in Los Angeles a major gathering of Islamic leaders, and we've been invited. Mark Leap, who's in the audience here, who's my counterterrorism commander, will be at that meeting, and he has been charged in my office with basically following the lead of the FBI in LA. The FBI has got an extraordinary council of Islamic leaders, business, religious community, and we're going to piggyback on that, same as we're piggybacking on Sheriff Barker's effort, that I don't need to reinvent the wheel, that in the case of Los Angeles, the FBI, the sheriff are already into those communities, so they've opened the door that we're able to basically walk in and get into the room.
The same. I mean, I think one of the great gifts the Manhattan Institute delivers is us being able to share best practices and learn best practices. So it wasn't a new idea for me that I reached out, and now I meet with all the imams of all the mosques in Providence every month. We know each other well. I now have my commanders regularly visit the mosques. When we have concerns, we're not just asking them for help. We're asking them to tell us when they're concerned that maybe their children are being harassed or there's a store that's been vandalized. This wasn't an idea that I woke up with in the middle of the night. I just saw what other police chiefs were doing that made sense. I had the opportunity to listen to other police chiefs, and I said, this is something I can bring to my city. I think that there are good practices. I think there are proper ways to do things, and that if we can learn that across the 17,000 communities in our country, it will benefit us all. My greatest experience learning this was when I was chief in Stamford, Connecticut, the big city north of New York, and on September 11th, what I learned, not only did we send people to help New York, but my citizens bring their fear home. They don't just see what's on television going somewhere else. They're worried about their home. And I think that as an incident occurs, the fear radiates across the country in every hometown. And communities need to know how to respond to that and need to have had those relationships and those best practices developed long before the crisis.
Rick, you wanted to add something there.
Well, I think Dean's absolutely right. I think it has to do with the constancy and the transparency of the relationship with the community, especially now since we're putting it in some context, and as Dean brought it up, with the Muslim community on 9/11. I had the opportunity to sit in a meeting with all of the imams, the leaders of the mosques from New Jersey. The concern was not whether there was involvement in what was happening in New York or down in Virginia. It was whether there was going to be civil disorder as a result of this event, whether there was going to be retribution or some type of vengeance against the Muslim community. And civil disorder in our state, statewide, is something that we're tasked with. So that brought about a different type of relationship even from 9/11 in our state, and I know that the FBI has continued to engage in that relationship. One of the things that we're doing right now, in keeping with the constancy of this, is many of you have heard of the Citizen Corps program, which is training ordinary citizens to be first responders, whether it's an attack, hopefully not, whether it's an automobile accident, whether it's something of fire, or whatever the case may be able to actually make an initial assessment to police and to help injured people. We're now going to the Muslim community to engage that community, which has traditionally been somewhat of a closed community, to engage them in that regard. We're not asking anything. We're continuing the relationship. We're keeping the relationship open, and we're creating a level of trust. It isn't just about mosque leaders that at some point in time you may want to engage the most trusting relationship with. It's the worshipers, the people who come from their jobs and go to the mosque. It's every single person who goes to a mosque, who goes to a church, who goes to a temple. And that relationship has to extend itself and develop trust across the community of those people. So,
Is that harder for a state police than a city police?
No, but I think it's everybody's responsibility, whether it's a city police department, a smaller local department, a county department, or a state police agency. We have a robust, as does Jeff, as does many of the police executives in this room, have a community outreach program, and people whose responsibility it is to make sure there's no break in the chain of this community outreach, that it's constant. And you really need to think, as part of both a homeland security and hometown security, which is another issue that involves crime, that you need to have those relationships strong. And it's really incumbent upon us as leaders of our organization to take the first step and to keep those relationships strong.
I don't think this is a high-risk question for the panel, because I know the SACs, or the special agents in charge of the FBI, that are in all of your respective territories personally. But I'd be interested from the standpoint of local, state, and city police executives at county, how has your relationship with that person, not just the FBI, because I think we've talked about that a lot, but the relationship between the chief of police, or the point person on this issue, and the special agent in charge of that city, wherever it is, how has that changed from September 10th, 2001 to now?
John, in Miami, literally, I also co-chair the South Florida Terrorism Task Force with the head of the FBI. But we literally talk on a daily basis. Now, when I was in New York and Philly prior to 9/11, he would talk to the FBI, on a big breaking case, but not on a regular basis. Now, it literally is on a regular basis. The problem, though,
I think we were good right there. Let's
no,
switch to
it
somebody
has
else.
to do with the FBI. Very sensitive. The problem that I'm having, we're 5 years now away from September 11th, and it's still not clear to me. It's still not clear to me who's in charge of intelligence in the United States. I get asked all the time, how do you get along with Homeland Security? I don't deal with Homeland Security. They send us money, but we don't deal with them. We deal with the FBI. I mean, the relationships are much better. Negroponte's office, I'm assuming they're putting together the master plan, but it's still 5 years out. There needs, Bush or somebody in Washington needs to stand up and say, listen, this is the person or entity that's in charge. And right now, that still hasn't happened. It's, so I rely on the FBI almost exclusively.
Let me take that.
Maybe you could take a stab at that one.
I might pass. Let me take a stab at something related, though. Judge Richard Posner, who's written a number of books on a wide array of subjects, has written 2 on intelligence and a series of op-eds. We've seen recent op-eds from John Lehman, the former Secretary of the Navy, a 911 Commission member, and a couple of others, saying it's time for an MI5, a domestic intelligence agency based on the British model. And that agency should be an intelligence agency only with no police powers to break up the FBI. And I'm wondering what the reaction of the people on the other end of that equation, the 18,000 law enforcement agencies, think. Is it time to invent another agency, a better agency? Do you see a benefit there that you're not getting now? Because it's not something that's it's a debate that's swelled in the intelligence community, but I haven't heard the police speak on it.
Well, I think that we're focusing too much on the structure and not on the concept. And I think that, there's been a lot of discussion, should the counterterrorism effort be led from the top down, federal agencies down to local, or from the bottom up? And I don't think it's either one of those things. I think it has to be an equal footing for both. And that we all have to be on an equal footing, and it may shift depending on what the circumstance is. But the structure to me, is not the question. I think that we have some very good agencies in this country, and getting back to your comment, there is some confusion over who is in charge of the intelligence, and we've experienced that as well. But I think if we focus more on the concept that local law enforcement and the federal intelligence community are all equal participants, and we have to look at this based on what we're dealing with at the time, and that needs to shift. Now, that makes management very uncomfortable, both in local law enforcement and in the intelligence community, because who's in charge of all of these assets? That's where that uncomfortable feeling comes in. In Los Angeles, we are in partnership with the LAPD, LA County Sheriff's Department, FBI, our primary partners in the Joint Regional Intelligence Center. In that center is a DHS representative, which has had a tremendous impact, and we really, truly, for the first time, feel connected to the Department of Homeland Security, and we have a very...
So, Sandra, that's interesting, because what you're saying is you don't care as much as John who's in charge, as long as you're getting the product from everybody.
Well, not exactly. I mean, I think that, again, I think we've gotten better at sharing intelligence. We've gotten much better at that, but it goes beyond sharing intelligence. I feel very strongly that local law enforcement needs to be an equal partner in this effort.
Anybody else on that?
John, I think the personal relationships are always going to be key to this in addition to the organizational relation, the personal, and I think we've gotten a lot better at that, either in relationship with SACs and the Bureau, and even now the emerging Homeland Security that myself in my capacity at LAPD, in my capacity at PERF, and as a part of the Major City Chiefs, we've really been not just knocking on the door, but basically battering down the door at Homeland Security to get in there and get that exchange going, those relationships. So we're going to see within the next month or so that Homeland Security will be coming out with a basically new set of policies that chiefs have been looking for that really define the exchange of information, how we're going to do it more openly, hopefully when they open up the new National Fusion Center, that some of the barriers that have existed in the old are going to be gone. And that at the same time, the relationships, 2 examples, that I've now got in my BlackBerry all the cell phone numbers for pretty much everybody into Homeland Security. at the FBI. I was just looking for it in the wallet, but I basically left it in my briefcase, which is the pass to get into the FBI offices. I can walk into the FBI offices.
Just admitted to a big
in.
security violation there. I'm going to have to write you up.
But it's the idea that it's an ID card that allows me access into the inner offices of the FBI. And a few years ago, that would not have happened. But a lot of that is personality-driven, and then the personalities hopefully then create the organizational interaction. But it does start with, going back, the issue of transparency. Jack, I think you could probably check, the first time I ever heard that term transparency was Jack Maple, 1995, New York City Police Department. He said, we need transparency in the NYPD. Nobody's talking to anybody here. And I think you'll probably, if you did a Google, you'd probably find the first time that word was ever used in government was Jack Maple in 1995. I think we have a lot more of that now, and that's a good thing. So we're moving, and it's not as fast as we'd like, but we're beginning.
Well,
It still begs the question. If you have more than one entity with the responsibility, there's nobody to hold accountable. So my preference is for Bush to get up and say, this is the person, this is the agency that's in charge of intelligence.
and we can bring all that up with the Attorney General later today. But I'm not touching that one with a 10-foot pole. I would like to follow up with the nut of the last question, which was among police chiefs. Does anybody feel like breaking in a new agency, an MI5? You've spent a great deal of time in Great Britain. So have you. I know you've visited. You've probably all looked at the models.
I support John's comment that we really need to identify who is the entity, because it's at the federal government level, it really still is morphing. Bureau, for example, has been asked on a dime to go from dealing with crime, reacting to crime, to now proactively dealing with terrorism. Whether you'll be able to make that transition in a timely fashion, it's still debatable. But there is, John's point, there is still no one person in charge. At the local level, we're still not sure where Negroponte fits in with Chertoff, fits in with Mueller, fits in, for that matter, with the Attorney General. We really, with Homeland Security, my prediction is a few years down the line, they're going to break it back up again. I think it got too damn big.
Rick's going to say something. I want to open it up to questions from the audience so that we can use the rest of the time to hear your thoughts on this.
I'm going to just try and sum up at least my view in one sentence. The law enforcement community across this country is flattening. It used to be where we talked about federal to state to county to local, but for the very same reason that we're here today, which is intelligence-led policing, is the understanding, and several of the other speakers brought it up, the individual police officer, detective, or trooper is going to raise the piece of information that's going to preempt the attack. The ability, much like they do in Israel, that every single police officer is a data collector, collects a piece of information with the emphasis on analysts that have to take these bits of information and then connect the dots and produce intelligence and produce an intelligence product. This is being done at all levels of the law enforcement community in this country. It's being done in the big cities very well. It's being done in state police agencies. And we're using fusion centers to do that. And that's why it's so important to either have a fusion center or to have a connection to a fusion center. In New Jersey, we have a fusion center. But what really synergizes our fusion center is that we connect to New York, and that we connect to Pennsylvania State Police, and to Delaware, and to Massachusetts State Police. And that's all very important, connecting the dots locally, and then connecting the dots regionally. So the law enforcement community is becoming flat, and that it's going to happen very, very soon that they may have to make that decision. Is out of this flatness, is there one individual or one agency that kind of needs to be the steering mechanism of this?
But interestingly enough, the law enforcement community is also becoming smaller. And that doesn't make sense to a lot of people. It obviously will never make sense to a police chief because we just want more. But I wonder why there are less police officers and less firefighters on duty in America than there were on September 11th. And the reason seems to be that the federal government left something that it had strongly supported for a long time. And every community was dependent on some federal money. There are less police officers on duty in this city and in every city in the country than there were on September 11th, with a few notable exceptions. Yet every city is now being asked to do more. I think the federal government has forgot what it was looking at and what it was doing successfully when it pivoted. And I wish they wouldn't have abandoned that strategy, because I think it would be good for Homeland Defense as much as hometown.
I think Chief Bratton's going to throw something in, but as we come up on noon, I don't want to cheat the audience on questions. I know Jeff Miller has a burning question there. Who's got the mics for the audience? Okay, you see, those are the microphone bearers. If you have a question, put your hand up. They'll find you. So you guys select somebody, get lined up, and we'll use that time, Chief, while they get over there.
Following up on Dean's comment and the crime conference we had last week in Washington, D.C. with 50 chiefs, 12 mayors, the absurdity, we're talking about moving toward the further exchange of information, the transparency, and this would be appropriate for the Attorney General when he's here, the absurdity of what's going on in Congress and the government right now on ATF, where some of the legislation that's being proposed, if I understand it, would preclude ATF from sharing gun information with us, but also now the idiots in Congress are now potentially proposing that we can't even share it among ourselves.
Well, what do you really think, though?
That will be, oh, I'm sorry, it is what it is. That with the 16,000 murders Dean's talking about, the majority of them by handguns, that they may now criminalize us from exchanging information among ourselves about information we gather on gun crime. So it's exactly what Dean's talking about. This, we're going in one direction, and they're fighting like hell to basically get access to phone records, computer records, which we need. And on the other hand, something that's killing 16,000 Americans every year, we're running like hell in the opposite direction, that we can't even talk among ourselves. So again, this balance, we need to discuss this, and it needs to get into the national debate, it needs to get into the national elections that are coming up, and it needs to get into the presidential debates also. That this conglomerate that we're creating is crazy, absolutely crazy.
All right, who's got our first question from the audience? Yes, sir.
I'm Michael Myers, Executive Director of the New York Civil Rights Coalition. The federal authorities say it's not a question of whether, but when the next attack will come, and even if it's not by air. I want to know from the police chiefs what more police powers are needed in order to prevent, for example, an anthrax attack in the subways of New York City, or an anthrax attack at Macy's department store. How do you protect the responders who come to the scene and the public at large in terms of antidotes or whatever, and prevent public disorder or civil disorder in those situations when we couldn't even protect them at the World Trade Center? And finally, what about, in terms of your police power, what about when it runs up against the culture of constitutionalism and civil liberties? I was very concerned to hear that there might be what you call informants, but spies in people's places of worship. There's a constitutional element here that people have not addressed, and I'd like you to address it in terms of police power versus civil liberties culture.
Who'd like to take that?
Well, I'd be glad to take it. Clearly, it's always a balancing act, and I think there's a recognition, certainly on the part of local law enforcement, that you don't want to turn off major segments of the community by being overly aggressive. But by the same token, there's a need to recognize that there's a real enemy out there. The enemy is amongst us. And there are a whole variety of ways. I wouldn't denigrate or somehow, informants are a normal function of policing. And when I was talking about informants, I was talking about some of the stuff you may get from a narcotics informant that has information. He's either giving it to you for money or he wants to stay out of jail, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's the other part. As far as what would you do to protect, I think we're in much better shape now than 9/11 on responding. There were tremendous lessons that were not learned in the first World Trade Center bombing. I was there in 1993, and there was an over-response to the point where there were 6,000 people actually injured. Only 1,000 went to the hospital by ambulance. The other 5,000 took subways because you couldn't get out of West Street. We're learning, particularly outside of places like New York, where it's only one police department, where you have multiple jurisdictions, that you need a coordinated response. The whole notion now of unity of command, the unified command, the command incident system, that really has been federalized. All officers are now trained on it. Funding is attached to it. Every police department is responsible for abiding by these federal regulations. And so we're in much better shape now as far as government, an attack happens, to respond and mitigate the damage and the injuries.
We have another question there.
I'm Jerry LaSalle from East Stroudsburg University of Pennsylvania. A recent journal article talked about perhaps the failure of academics not to predict 9/11, and it spoke about how with the spiraling of the Cold War issue, academics began to concentrate on a new emerging nuclear threat either in Pakistan, Korea, or China. But the question I have is, what role or what collaboration, or how can the academic institutions assist law enforcement and the law enforcement community in either preventing future attacks, conducting research, getting grants, or looking at this new homegrown threat?
Okay, Rick?
Well, Jerry, that's an absolutely ridiculous question.
And did you write that Wall Street Journal story?
Jerry actually used to,
Okay.
Jerry actually used to work for me, so I had the liberty of saying it to him. Actually, the reason we're all here is because of the strength of our academic collaborations. Very personally, the re-engineering of our division with intelligence-led policing is due greatly to the advice and counsel we've gotten from the Manhattan Institute. Some of our more vibrant anti-crime programs, particularly the Safer Cities initiatives in New Jersey and Operation Ceasefire, which has worked successfully in one city for us and is now being taken to 10 cities, is as a result of our academic collaboration with the Police Institute. And I give all due credit here to George Kelling, who's worked with many of us here that are up on the dais. So quite frankly, it's not in any way a forced collaboration. It's something that's been long overdue for us, and it's absolutely essential, and we're going to continue to draw strength from our academic collaborations, and we thank them.
We've got time for one more. Oh, maybe that was you just saying we have 1 minute and just to wrap up. Do we have one more? Okay.
Here you go, it's the Wall Street Journal.
Bobby Block. Now, bear in mind, he's a ringer.
You don't pay me enough to be a ringer. I'm wondering, as I'm listening to this, do you think we're heading into what I would call almost the Katrina law enforcement effect, in which what we're making a mistake by dividing terrorism from criminal law enforcement instead of integrating it into it? That we're treating them as two separate things when in reality they really have to be seamlessly integrated and treated as one.
Well, I think you have a good point. And I think we're not doing that, because if you look at
Making just the opposite point, the idea of
if you look at the Torrance case,
a
it
force
spells it.
multiplier effect. Exactly what we did to get control of traditional crime in the 90s, if you think of it, is exactly what we're going to have to do to get control of terrorism. They're using the CompStat model, timely, accurate intelligence, rapid response to the intelligence, effective tactics, relentless follow-up, and the transparency, the exchange of information. So I think just the opposite, Bobby. We're all actually talking about this is the way we need to go. I think that we're beginning to get some response to that. For example, the willingness for the fusion centers to fund the computer systems. For example, the $10 million in Homeland Security money we're going to spend on our fusion center computer systems for the gathering of intelligence from all of the police departments in the Los Angeles County area can also be used for criminal analysis purposes, so that the duality of the use of that money, allowing us to use it for dual purposes, is a major step in recognition that traditional crime is going to, in fact, probably end up helping to inform on dealing with the new type of crime.
It's noon, so we're going to end it on that to stay on schedule. But I'd like to thank our panelists.